So, as Kaustoff and I have mentioned in previous episodes, we only interview guests that genuinely interest both of us. So, I know that if I present a guest to Kaustoff and he's not interested at all, he's going to give me a big hell no, and I'm going to do the exact same thing. But good news, today's guest is very interesting to both of us. He gets a big thumbs up from both of us. And his name is John Chen, and he's an NBA analytics expert, and his resume proves it. So, a little background on John. He got his bachelor's degree in computer science from Rice University and also recently completed his PhD in computer science from Rice University. His career has gone from co-founder and CTO of data science firm Valhalla Healthcare. And from there, he was a applied scientist at Microsoft. And right now he is a senior machine learning engineer at Meta. And that's actually not how I know John. I know John because of his Medium blog, where he does advanced basketball analytics. So in his spare times, he's been a basketball analytics coordinator at Central Michigan University and a basketball advanced scout at the University of Wyoming. And he writes in-depth basketball analytics blogs on Medium, like I mentioned, and you should check those out. I'll include those in the link in the bio. So, John, we are incredibly excited to meet with you. So thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Great to have you on the show, John. I think when I was reading through your LinkedIn as well as through your Medium post, you clearly have a ton of priorities. So thanks for making the time for both Parker and I. So can you share with us a little bit how your journey into basketball analytics began?
I think like a lot of other people, the interest started in basketball. So I grew up playing basketball, I grew up watching basketball. I spent most of my childhood growing up overseas. So I'm mostly from Hong Kong. And I played basketball competitively till the end of high school. Going into college, I was thinking about what I wanted to do. And I quickly decided computer science was something that was really interesting. In particular, machine learning and AI seemed like a very promising direction to go for the future. So in college, I decided I wanted to merge these two things together. For a while, I was a student manager at my D1 college, Rice University. And I also worked for a little bit as a data journalist at the Houston Rockets. But it wasn't quite until after I left college that I wanted to spend a little bit more time diving deeper into basketball analytics. So last year, what I did was I sent emails out to every single D1 school out there. I prepared some scouting reports, some analytics reports, and eventually a few of them wanted to work with me. And that's how I got roles in the college team last year. This summer, I wanted to be a little bit more ambitious. I wanted to work with some MBA teams. So I dived a little deeper into MBA analytics, which is how the Medium blog came about. And that's why I'm also here today.
And so I didn't know that you grew up in Hong Kong. So who was your favorite player growing up or your favorite team growing up?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think my answer is very common, but I think like many other fans growing up overseas, my favorite basketball player was Kobe and my favorite team were the Lakers.
Are they still your favorite team? Or are you so deep in analytics that you kind of try to separate your love for the game and you just look at the numbers?
I think when I was younger, I really liked Kobe because Kobe was kind of our generation. Michael Jordan, he was a really great one-on-one. He had tons of moves. He was great to watch. But as I got older, I kind of started to realize when you look deeper into the analytics, Kobe is definitely one of the best players ever, but he's probably not like a top 5, top 10 player. And I think the hallmark of analytics, maybe for the last 10 to 15 years, is probably Stephen Curry and James Harden to a lesser extent. And since I played mostly point guard and shooting guard growing up, I've now become more of a player fan. So I think now I'm a fan of Stephen Curry, but not really a fan of a particular team. And I agree with you. I think, especially for professional analysts, if you have a favorite team or a favorite player, it's really easy to get those rose tinted glasses. So it's important to look at the data to get a more objective take on things.
I'm going to have another question about James Harden a little bit later because I did not expect you to say that.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely.
Yeah. So I think one of the questions that we had was like, so is your ultimate goal to become a GM in the NBA?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is yes. I thought a little bit this summer about what I wanted my path to be. So one other thing I didn't mention was I also spent a gap semester back home as an assistant JV coach, and I really enjoyed that. And I was thinking that maybe in the future, I'd want to get into basketball coaching because I have a decent amount of basketball background knowledge. But thinking more about it objectively, there are just tons of coaches out there with more experience than me on the basketball side of things. Like most of them are at least a C1 college player. Even someone, when you think about Coach Pop, he is as someone who played professional basketball before as well. It's just the stories of similar to Coach Bo in Miami. It's just not very common. And someone with my kind of background getting into coaching, there's just way more candidates out there who are going to be more competitive. So I think also diving more into analytics is kind of, there are different ways you can influence the success of an organization. And being a GM is probably up there, if not more than being a head coach. So based off of that, my background and what I know now, I think just going for that kind of path is a better match for my skills.
I've heard from some of my friends that just getting into basketball is so difficult, whether it's data science or sales, you name it. It's just such a hard barrier to break. What's your experience been like trying to get your foot in the door?
It's definitely challenging. So I think with sports and maybe regular industry, it's very different. So for example, in the tech industry, as long as you reach a certain skill level and then you get a little bit lucky and you keep trying, you can generally get into one of the top tech companies. But in sports, there's like a supply demand issue because there's so many people who love sports, but there's only so many roles. I think this is particularly bad in basketball because there's one clear top league in the world, which is the NBA, and there's only 30 teams. And in terms of analytics, most teams only have 2 or 3 analytics spots. So you can imagine there's all these people trying to get in, but there's very few roles available, and that becomes very difficult. I think with sports, it's not just about your skills, it's also about who you know, a lot more than maybe in the tech industry. So I think in that sense, it's definitely a lot more difficult to get into basketball. For me, the way that I got in was I tried to develop some kind of a portfolio before approaching these teams. And honestly, I spent a lot of time just reaching out to people. I probably reached out to thousands of people in the college basketball space before a few got back to me. So I'd say in basketball or in sports in general, you just have to keep trying. It's not always easy to have that differentiator, but you do need to put in that extra legwork to get it to work.
Do you listen to Bill Simmons at all?
I do not. I read his book before, but I do not listen to his podcast.
I bring that up because he was saying like the typical strategy for becoming a GM is you just become friends with a billionaire that eventually might own an NBA team. And when I heard that, I'm like, that's not a strategy at all. Like that is the most like unlikely scenario ever. Like, all right, I'm going to befriend this billionaire. Maybe one day another billionaire decides to sell a team and then he buys it and is still friends with me.
That's hilarious. If you can do that, by all means, I mean, I wish I could do that, but I don't know any billionaires. If I do know one, I'll let you guys know. Maybe we can all get in on this.
Absolutely.
And right now, which GMs are really using advanced analytics and you look up to those people?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think historically, my favorite GM is probably Sam Pinky. He gets a ton of flack for what he did.
You'll love why you said that in a sec.
I didn't expect that.
I mean, he's not active anymore as far as I know, but or not as active as he used to be. But I think from a pure stats perspective, what he did was completely right. In the past, now they've evened the odds a little bit, but even now, when your team's not doing good, you should really just go out for a full out tank. It kind of sucks for the product and it sucks for fans, but it's definitely the right thing to do. And I think he took the fall for it, which is really unfortunate. And someone else came in and reaped the rewards. But I think what he did was completely right. And I think I would do the same if I was in his position.
The trivia here is this is something we were going to ask you anyways. What do you think about Sam? Because when we were fundraising for our seed round, I actually had the great opportunity to speak with Sam for a few hours and trying to pitch Paradime to him. So I actually met him face to face in a Zoom call because it was during COVID. And that's why we were like, have you heard about him? What do you think about his tanking strategy? And organically, you've probably answered that question already. So between the four of us, we have something in common, which is actually having met the person.
Yeah, that's really cool. Speaking of people that we've met, when I was a student at Rice, Daryl Morey would come to Rice usually, I think, a couple of times a year to give talks. And I got to meet him a few times in person too. It's always cool to meet these people in person. And I think if you had to pick he's not a GM anymore, but he's director of basketball operations. But his role is very similar to what he used to be. But I think with a more of a focus on just the basketball side, I know he's not a GM, but he'd probably be my pick for the current NBA. I remember him coming to Rice and giving a talk. And you can just see that even back then, his approach was very different. A lot of us, I think, or a lot of more casual fans, we rely a lot on more on the quote unquote eye test, I think, which is very natural because we all watched basketball growing up. And that's what you love about the game. You watch a game, you love the highlights. These are all things that make the game great. But when you're the GM or when you're making decisions that help your team win, you can't really get into those things. So, for example, I remember one thing that he mentioned was when they were playing Kobe Bryant in the playoffs, one thing that they noticed from the stats is that Kobe Bryant is a really great player. And he pretty much is above average for every single kind of shot that he takes. But when he takes those contested mid-range jump shots, he is in like one of the highest percentiles for taking that kind of a shot. But that shot is still a terrible shot in terms of expected points. So that was one thing that I really remember from his talk is that basically what they try to do was if they let him take these contested mid-range jump shots that we know as kind of Kobe Bryant's bread and butter, but actually were very poor from an analytics standpoint. They didn't end up winning, but in terms of how much talent they had on that team, I think that was a team with like Chuck Hayes and a few other people. They did a fantastic job against the Lakers.
Were those like the Shane Battier days too? Or is
Um,
this like a different era that you're referring to?
I think it was the Shane Battier days. I think I don't remember what he was talking, Yurka was talking about, but I think those days.
So going on with that, like eye test versus advanced analytics, in what scenarios are advanced analytics incredibly beneficial, like undeniably beneficial? When do they fail?
Main challenge of analytics is the data. You have to have enough data and enough good quality
Mhm.
data. And I think the reality is for most leagues outside the NBA, you don't have enough data, even for the college game. So for people not too familiar with the American college system, so in the 160 or so D1 teams, and there's a huge resource difference. And for the vast majority of these teams, you really only have the game tape and you don't really have anything else. And so for these teams, the game tape is there's this company called Synergy that takes all of these tapes and tries to log them in certain purposeful ways. In reality, even that is it's a very coarse way to take a look at things. And on top of that, in college basketball, play about 30 games a year. So there's really not another really accurate sense of how good players are. So there's definitely still a role for the eye test. Advanced a much more accurate perspective when you have a lot. So at the NBA level, for sure, it doesn't really make sense to rely on the eye test. You really just want to look at that. For the college game, I think there's more of a mix of both. You can look at analytics, but it's also important to take a look at the player to see if it confirms the data stays.
So when you were at the college level, were you having to create your own data? Because you said like, you only had 30 games a season and like to calculate an accurate plus minus, you want 3 years of historic. Were you having to go back to high school for some players or create your own data just to do a simple statistical analysis?
I think there's two main questions here. So one is at the college level and what can be done at college level.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of what can be done at a college level, you can definitely try your best to go for that plus minus approach. But it's not, I think it's more, you need more than 3 seasons if you only get 30 games a year. But in college, players don't play more than usually 4 seasons. It's also a period of time where they're improving really quickly. So it's also difficult. So I think in general, you can definitely go for that approach, but it's going to be a lot more noisy. There are some out there that do have advanced analytics for college players. I'd say that they generally do a real job, but in terms of the accuracy, there's definitely a big gap with the NBA. And I think the other part of that question is what I actually ended up doing. So for most college teams, besides maybe the top like 20, they really don't have many resources. They have maybe 4 or 5, maybe up to 7 people on staff to cover all aspects of the basketball operation. So not just coaching players, but in terms of who's going to book the flights, who's going to book the buses, who's going to make players get fed, where they're going to eat, strength and nutrition, where the player's going to live. If the player's AC breaks, who's over there and fix it for them. Like there's all sorts of things that they need to cover. And so the reality is analytics is very low on their list of priorities, even though we may know it to be really important. The college teams, they only really have the resources to take a look at some basic things like who the opponent 3-point shooters are, who are their high usage players, what are the moves that they go to, are they officials? And that's kind of the level of granularity that most college teams can get to.
And what sort of tools or applications do you rely on when you are doing your analytics work?
Different teams use different things. The teams generally be more I would say, standard data science setup. They have data engineers, they have maybe a front engineer building some dashboards, and they have data scientists. I primarily use Python and I code everything in Python. So that would be the tool that I use. There's some useful packages, PyTorch, and so on and so forth. There seems to be some rumors out there that are maybe unsubstantiated that maybe NBA is going to start charging money for them, which is going to be prohibitively expensive for individuals. But I don't know the details about that. That's just a rumor I've heard. Besides the NBA API, there are also like ESPN and so on that you can pull data from. If not, you can write your own like crawler to do it. But I think in the NBA, they primarily do data sources. So one is Synergy, which I previously mentioned. And what they do is they just break down film. They break down every shot into like, is it a hook shot? Is it a 3-point shot? And so on. And then one is second, which is, you may have heard, they have all these cameras in NBA stadiums, which keep track of every position of every player. I think it's like 25 frames per second or some sort of granularity like that. So I think these are the two main data sources. So the Synergy and the second spectrum data are the two main data sources for NBA.
Do you end up using both, like, let's say in relation, but you also end up using video data, which is amalgamation of frames or images or computer vision? So do people actually process both image information and structured information for their analysis?
That's a great question. I think in terms of image data, I would say no. I think there are companies out there that use computer vision to translate the video into various coordinates. And I don't think you can get much more information out of developing a specific computer vision model just to learn the video. So I think the most teams would deal in terms of just structured data. I think the most unstructured data that it would get is the second spectrum data, which are just the rows like of each event. So where the players are every single second. That's probably as far as it goes. I would say that's probably still like halfway between unstructured and structured. It's still, it's not like just straight up image or text, but it is so high volume that you would need to develop some very specific tools for that.
If you imagine the basketball court as a 2D space, you end up with like XY coordinates for each player at like every minute on that.
You can do that. Yeah. So I think for the teams that do use the like kind of like per second data of the coordinates of all the players, it is based off of XY, but I'm not too sure if all teams are using that. It's the challenge of you only have so many analysts and the ROI on that is not that high. There can be other things that you can do. So I think the player value is one of the most important parts of the NBA, but there's also draft, which also needs analytics. There's also in-game analytics, like when you want to use timeouts, that sort of thing. And there may be other things as well. So I think given the resources, I'd say, my guess is people try to, it's like kind of like the 80-20 rule. Like you try to go for that structured data first, and you only really want to touch that high volume kind of coordinate data if you really have to.
And you've done a few blogs on regularized adjusted plus minus. Got it out of my mouth. Just a little background. So plus minus calculates the effectiveness on a player on defense and offense. So the higher the plus on defense, the better the player. The higher the plus on offense, better the player, basically. And in your models, you found that Nikola Jokic has the highest plus minus, probably the best player in the NBA. No surprise there. But you did like a top 10 list, and there were some names that jumped out to me, like Paul George and Donovan Mitchell, just because from a casual fan perspective, I see them and I'm just like, they put up numbers, but they don't really contribute to winning, and they've broken my heart several times, mainly Donovan Mitchell. I was a Utah Jazz fan. So from your analytics, which players jumped out to you the most?
Basketball has a really unique set of characteristics, which is you play a ton of games every year, you score a lot of the time, and also you have a ton of substitutions, which makes methods like regularized adjust plus minus really suitable. So even raw plus minus, I think, is one that's easier to understand, which is just when you're on the court, how many work points do you score, basically. And but the problem with that is it's very noisy because you can share the court. If I share the court with LeBron James, I'm going to be a great player, even though I'm definitely not an NBA player. So the question is, how can you parse those? And regularized adjust plus minus is really just a linear regression approach to where you treat every single player as a variable and you try to estimate what their plus minus is. And I think with just RAPM, you need a lot of seasons of data, particularly if you account for nowadays players' rest or if they're injured and there's all sorts of reasons they may get a more noisy RAPM. In general, I think the community views RAPM as still quite noisy, which is why they want to regress it against something else to get a better prediction. So I think you mentioned Donovan Mitchell and Paul George. I would say the star of RAPM is Alex Caruso. So for whatever reason, he often comes up as a top 10 in terms of just RAPM. My guess is he probably at some point shared the court with someone really great, like LeBron James or someone with a fantastic plus minus. And it just happened to be in the time off the court. With the other person off the court, maybe he got a couple of steals or maybe he just got lucky, but he racked up a great plus minus in those minutes, which made the model think that, oh, maybe he's the one contributing to this. And so he's really great. But so I think the extension of that is what most people do is from RAPM, you have this estimate of a player's kind of true plus minus. And then you try to predict that using only the player variables. So for example, like points, offensive efficiency, offensive on off, and all sorts of things like that. And that's where you get a more accurate estimate of plus minus. So I think one of the interesting things out of there is also you can see that you can take a look at what the difference is between RAPM and your predicted RAPM, and you can kind of get a sense of where the model has probably gotten it wrong. And Alex Caruso is one of those. He's probably good enough to be a solid starter, but he's definitely not a top 5 player. He's not leading any team to NBA championships, but he's going to be a really good role player. And I think the Medium blog is slightly out of date now. I did a lot more work in that space for predicting RAPM. And I think based off of my latest models, probably the most surprising person in the top maybe 15 is Drew Holiday. And if I could pick 2, also James Harden. I think to most fans, you'd be like, oh, Drew Holiday is definitely not a top 15 player, or if anything, he's definitely not the best player on his own team. And James Harden has fallen off a lot recently. But based off of the advanced stats, they're still a top 15 players.
Yeah, Drew Holiday's less of a surprise to me just because we have the luxury of seeing that he was traded to the Milwaukee Bucks and they won that season. And people were like, this trade is insane. But like, he was just such a huge contribution, mainly on defense. And yeah, the James Harden one, is that based off his performance in previous years with the Nets and the Rockets? And like, it's kind of, the average RAMP makes him still a top 15 player, or do you still believe that he's top 15?
So I think the way that I've set up my data is like probably a lot of other people in this space, I have an exponential moving average of all of his variables. So there is definitely a heavier weight on recent performances, but there is also a bit of a lag just because you need that sort of thing to smooth out the noise. Because sometimes players get hot for some games, but really it's just noise.
Yeah.
For me personally, I still think he's a top 15 player. But there is the question of how much is he worth for his next contract? Because it's not just about how good he is now, but how good is he going to be 3 years down the line? And I think that's definitely a bigger question.
Or if he's even going to play this season.
If he's going to play at all, then
that won't be good for his plus minus.
Right.
So a follow-up question from there is, when you are starting, let's say, a brand new analysis, what's like your typical planning process? Like, what do you do to avoid wasting time?
I'm still in that process a little bit where I'm deciding if I want to formalize my system. So I've been talking to a couple of NBA teams and G League teams to potentially consult with them, in which case I just plug into their system instead, which is why I'm a little bit hesitant on starting things myself. So right now, everything is just in a big notebook. But obviously at companies like where I work, you have much more formalized systems. You have a feature store, for example. That's probably the first thing I'd want to implement. And you'd have all sorts of data pipelines. But right now, the way that I work is I have a couple pieces of code, which essentially set up that feature store that take like an hour to run. And so every time I want to do something, I just run that first, and then I do whatever analysis I want next. So it's definitely not a good permanent setup. I would recommend, professionals. I mean, you guys definitely know this. You get set up on like AWS or Azure or something like that. Use a feature store, use data pipelines, all that stuff makes your life way easier. But right now for me, my setup is really bad. Don't copy this. It's just all in a big notebook.
You are still in the startup phase. Do you have like data pipelines, for example, set up so that some sort of Airflow job set up, which is like, really fresh data always gets captured or runs on a daily basis and then populates and feeds your feature store, something of that sort?
I definitely should. So that would be the plan if I wanted to do something a little more professional. So right now, I essentially use Google Drive as a data store. So I have a piece of code at the beginning of my notebook, which essentially reads in all of the data and takes a look at what's not there and then downloads it and then processes it and then resaves it into Google Drive. So definitely I should be using something like Airflow, but right now that's my setup.
You have your own personal AWS S3.
Yeah, I mean, definitely if I wanted to take this step further, I mean, I would definitely get set up on AWS.
I was trying to find you on GitHub just to see if any of the stuff you do in your analysis is available. Do you have a GitHub that's publicly available or anything beyond your blog that I could take a look at?
I don't currently. I think I'm just very cautious about what I want to publish online. I mean, I'd love to. I think giving back to community is great, but at the same
Yeah.
time, I also want to maintain my kind of edge when it comes to working in the MBA because that's something that I want to do eventually.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
think I'm. If anyone is curious about anything, they could definitely reach out to me and happy to discuss further. It sounds kind of sad, but the best way to reach me is probably LinkedIn. Like I don't maintain any sort of real social media presence. But right now I don't have a GitHub, but I'm happy to provide any sort of pointers or code samples if anyone is ever interested.
I'm going to start running some of your projects, so I might have a question down the road. But I mean, your blogs have really outlined just how to do a lot of the basic regressions for RAMP just with Google Sheets. So that's going to be super helpful when I get started on it. Another question I have for you is, do you use your analytics expertise for sports betting?
I wish. So I think I took a look at this when I was younger and it's not, back in I think it was like 2016, it wasn't super difficult to beat Vegas. But I did notice a couple of things, which is if you go onto the websites that have like a smaller bid ask, so basically a smaller spread, they'll generally kick you out if you start winning, and they won't let you bet large amounts. And then if you go onto those major sites, then you have the problem that their spread is often like 5% or more, and it becomes difficult to beat those. So that was my experience. I don't know if anyone else has been more successful with that, but it seems like it's difficult to beat them when they can set the rules themselves.
Yeah, they can kick you out. That's messed up. I know that's a thing in like Texas Hold'em. I didn't know they could do that with sports betting. That's messed up. Like, hey, you're too good at your job, so
Yeah.
we can't
You're
let you
better
work
than
here.
us. Don't come here.
Yeah.
The house always wins, so we're gonna make sure the house wins.
Yeah, they can make things difficult for you in all kinds of ways, like make it difficult for you to take your money out, to put more money in. They can lock your account. It's not easy to
Yeah.
win.
Is it frowned upon? So if you're trying to get into the NBA, obviously you said you don't sports bet, so it doesn't matter. But is it frowned upon if someone with analytics expertise is doing sports betting and they're trying to get into the NBA?
I'm not sure it's frowned upon as much as I'd say they're kind of different skill sets. So
Mhm.
in analytics in the NBA, I think generally you'd focus on one of those three major categories, either like player value, draft, or in-game. Some people do all three. I'd say that's kind of a very different set of targets or labels, or what you're trying to
Mhm.
predict as opposed to which team is going to win. So you don't get a very, very strong correlation between let's say a summation or a minutes weighted summation of plus minus for a team versus how likely they are to actually win a particular game. And I think part of that is just because to beat the odds, you have to be really accurate with probability. And that just doesn't, plus minus doesn't quite give you that in that way. So I'd say I'm actually not too sure if it's necessarily frowned upon as so much people usually just concentrate on either on analytics or on betting. And there's not that much overlap between them.
Yeah, I remember the Mavericks hired a sports bettor. Do you know about that story?
Yeah, it's
It was like 4 years ago. They hired someone to join their front office that was just amazing at sports betting. And I think he only lasted like 2 years. The players hated him. They did not like his approach. So I don't know if that means that it's not effective or, if it was just Luka Doncic being really mad at the situation.
yeah, I'm not sure what the real situation was, but I definitely heard about that. I think his Twitter handle is Haralabob. He was a very successful bettor. I used to follow him when I used to use Twitter. And I think I'm not too sure exactly what went down, but for sure, I think when it comes to player management, you can't go in with too much of a heavy hand. I think that applies in general across sports. Like there are many things, managers that really are just great people managers. Like in soccer, Sir Alex Ferguson, one of the best managers ever. He was really known for being a great people manager, but he didn't really do anything related to tactics. And that's really important when it comes to the NBA too. They're really star dominated. You really need to make sure your stars are happy. You don't really want to come in and force them to do something they don't want to. So I don't really know what went down, but I think that may be one of the reasons it didn't work out.
I'm going to look into him. I'm going to learn more about that. Yeah. So the thing that got me interested in NBA analytics, and like it just brought everything to the mainstream for most casual fans was the No Stats All-Star article in 2009. It's about like Shane Battier and how he is like the most effective player on the court, obviously, even though he didn't have many stats. And so you've mentioned Alex Caruso as like a low stats guy who's really impactful on a team. Who's another player that you put in that category that really, isn't putting up a lot of points, rebounds, but it's just really damn good?
So I definitely remember reading that article. I just don't remember what exactly it was about. In terms of players that don't put up great stats, but are really good, you have to think a little bit about that. I think in general, the top maybe like 20 or 30 players are all players that put up huge stats. In part just because there aren't that many utility players in the NBA anymore, in the sense that if you're not a ball dominant, like high efficiency offensive player, you are a 3-and-D player. Otherwise, you don't really get any game time. So everyone has kind of become either one of those two categories. So someone like Shane Battier isn't really that uncommon anymore because everyone is kind of a utility player. That's kind of my impression. Like you have to be, if you're not good at shooting threes, then you better be the best defender in the NBA. If you're not a good defender, you have to be the lights out shooter, and ideally be both. So I'm not sure anyone comes to mind. I'm kind of looking at my list, rank of players. I think maybe someone like Derek White is someone that doesn't put up huge numbers, but really impacts the game. But I wouldn't say he's someone that flies under the radar. I think people regularly bring up how Derek White is like fantastic in advanced analytics, even though his stats aren't great. So I think that would probably be my pick. I think he's in my somewhere in the 40s, I'd say, in my plus minus rank. So yeah, so it would probably be him.
I love seeing Gary Payton Jr. in your RAPM too.
Yeah,
I agree with that. He's awesome.
Gary Payton definitely puts in a lot of effort. He's a great defender. And I don't remember his 3-point percentage recently, but if he has a 3-point shot, then he becomes a dream player, right? It's someone who's great on defense and a great shooter.
I have a follow-up question to that. Let's say you are running an analytics team or running an analytics function within an NBA team. What in your opinion would be like the top 3 metrics that you would want to analyze after a game?
Post-game analytics is definitely something that is an important part of the game. So it helps you keep a track on how your team is doing. As for the stats I'd keep track after a game, I would need to think about that a little bit. I think the challenge with looking at game by game stats is it's just so noisy. Like frequently you can play better than your opponent, but still lose. Like the time where the Rockets missed, what was it, like 27 threes in a row or something like that. They were just really unlucky. They probably should have won that series. Yeah, I'm not sure. I need to think about that a little bit. I would say the edge in analytics is mainly in the player value and draft evaluation. When it comes to in-game analytics, you don't really have that much of an edge. Like maybe it's good just to take a look at how your team did, but I don't know if there is. Yeah, I actually, nothing really comes up to mind for specifically what I'd look at for a particular game. But over the course of a season, you definitely want to take a look at just general things like how well your team is shooting from 3. Maybe you want to break it down by position and by areas of the court. You probably definitely want to take a look at plus minus and maybe combinations as well, like which pairs do well. But I think for game by game, actually nothing really comes up to mind for something I'd really want to look at on a game by game basis.
And from a season perspective, what would be your top of mind numbers?
Yeah, so I think the most important part, and this is just my personal opinion, but I think the biggest factor of success for a team is really just the talent that you have. And in general, I wrote an article about this, but I think there are also other articles out there about this. But basically, you need a really good player, like one of the best players in the NBA, to really have a shot at a championship. And you need your second best player to also be maybe the best player on a non-contending team. You don't want it to be that kind of level. And you really need these 2 factors, plus like maybe a third player who is like a good second option on a non-contending team. You need to have all 3 of those players to really have a chance of winning a championship. I think if I were to be, let's say a GM or something like that, that would be the main thing I would be looking at is you look at your roster composition and see what you're missing. If you don't really have anyone who's a game changer, then you tank, basically. And if you're in a good spot, you have assets, maybe you have good cap room coming up, and you kind of take a look at who are the stars around the league that you think could fit well on your team and who you could potentially trade for or attract. I think that would be the most important thing. I think things like in-game analytics and things like that are things that are also important, but not nearly as important as just forming your team in the right way. So I think looking back, there were definitely things that are important, like things like if you suck at shooting threes, get more 3-point shooters. If you suck at protecting the rim, like get a rim protector, those kind of things. But I think that getting those three really good players is definitely, it should be top of mind for every GM out there.
And Kalstov, he actually did a really interesting analysis on that exact thing. So he discovered that since 2013, every NBA champion has had a top 10 player, a player within the top 25, and a player in the top 50. Also, is that based on your RAPM analysis, or is that a different analysis that you did?
That's based off of the predicted RAPM. So
Okay.
I imagine if we go all the way back in time, it'd be very similar. I don't think there are many outliers. I think this year's Heat was the biggest outlier. I personally don't think they deserve to win the majority of their series. I think they just got really lucky.
Mhm.
But yeah, in general, historically, you need that really great player to have a shot at winning a championship. And for that particular analysis, they only went back to around 2013. It's because at the time I only had stats back into to around 2013. Because there's some stats that didn't start being recorded until that time. But if you were to do a more simple analysis on simpler factors, I imagine you find a very similar trend to the last 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, that was my last question for you. Is I saw that, and since 2013, it makes sense. I can identify who those three players are at the top 50 for each team. One I'm really interesting is like the 2000, I think it was 2003 Pistons that won. Do you know of anybody that's analyzed that team and kind of figured out if it was just noise, like you've explained, or like if there's something that makes more sense?
Yeah, I think
Why
that
they won?
that would be the team I would pick as well for not having a like superstar player. Like every other, if you just think about like if you have Shaq, you have Jordan, Olajuwon, Shaq, Kobe, Tim Duncan, and LeBron, you've got like the majority of championships already in like the last 20 years.
Uh-huh.
I think that's the Pistons team is the one that stands out for me as well. I'm sure there's some analysis out there, but I haven't looked at it yet. But that's probably an example of where they had a bunch of good players, but no real superstar, and they played great defense. There's also an era in which efficiency was really low, and maybe they caught some sort of luck there. But that's definitely the team I'd look at as the one that kind of defied this trend.
What stuck out to me throughout this conversation is that when I try to explain an outlier, or when I ask you a question like, what surprises you? Your answer has been, oh, that's just noise. And I've never looked at it through that lens where it's like, no, like there are things that are unpredictable, but no, that's just noise. And that's something that's a pattern that we try to figure out in data. So that's been super interesting to me.
Yeah, definitely. I think there are two main pet peeves for me in this area. So one is the graphic always comes up when a team is up 3-2. They're like, oh, 82% of the teams that are up 3-2 end up winning the series or something like that. But we think of it from probability, like even if they're evenly matched teams, you would expect them to win 75% of the time. And then you account for they're probably a little bit better, which is why they're up 3-2, then you get 82%. It totally makes sense. I think the other pet peeve for me is when they showed that graphic of, oh, this starting lineup is like this positive plus minus. So they should like play that starting lineup all the time. But if you think about it, like if you have a starting five, they're either playing against someone else's starting lineup or someone else's not starting lineup. So in general, you would expect them to have a positive plus minus, but there's not really anything.
Can you explain that second part a little bit better?
Yeah. So the thing is, like you take any starting lineup of even a bad team, and if you take a look at all of the players that they're playing against, when all five of them are on the floor together, they're the starting lineup of their team. And at tip-off, they're playing the starting lineup of another team. But if there's any point in time in which the five of them are still on the court, but the opponent makes a substitution, they're subbing one of their starters or one of their bench players. So they're getting worse. But that's still in the plus minus of the original starting five. So in the sense that, so let's say let's say that the Pistons had a starting five, right? And they're playing OKC. In the beginning, it's like the starting five of the Pistons against starting five of the OKC. But the moment that the OKC makes a substitution where the Pistons is not, all of a sudden, it's like the starting lineup of the Pistons playing against like four players in the starting lineup of OKC plus one of their subs. So in general, you would expect that a particular starting lineup, there's been a decent amount of time playing against lineups of other teams, which are not just their entire starting lineups. So on average, you'd expect them to play lineups that are worse than them. So in general, starting lineups, even not bad teams, have positive plus minuses.
Gotcha. Okay. And I didn't mean to say, can you explain that better? I was meaning to say, can you explain that to someone that doesn't understand it? Kidding. Well, John, thank you so much for your time. This conversation was really interesting to me. I love reading your blog. I hope you have time to continue it. I don't know how you even have time to write it as a machine learning engineer at Meta, but I'm thankful that you do. And I really hope you get an opportunity in the NBA or G League as well sooner than later.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was really fun. And definitely I'll keep keeping track of your podcasts.
Awesome. We really appreciate it. Have a good
Thanks
day,
for
John.
coming, John.
Yeah,
Have a
thank you.
great day.
You too.
Cheers. Bye.
How about that?
It was pretty good, hey?
Yeah, that was really fun.
I didn't expect that he would say his favorite GM is Sam Hinkie, and we had
Yeah, I know.
that.
I was like, that's so cool.
It's like you met a person and you think that you know, and that's his favorite person.
Yeah, like the only person that you know in the NBA is his favorite GM.
Yeah. It's like, what are the odds and what are the chances of that, huh?
Yeah.
So yeah, that was pretty cool. I mean, for me, that was like the coolest moment. I was like, how did that come?
So Sam Hinkie, I doubt you'll ever listen to this, but if you do, when Paradime raises another round, we're interested. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. No, what I'm gonna do. This is like a great segue, because once this is done, I can actually probably WhatsApp him the link to kind of say
Yeah.
like, hey, you remember we spoke, but we just had like a conversation around this, and the guy, and we're speaking with someone for whom you are an idol. He looks up to you. So yeah.
What was your biggest takeaway?
For me, I was interested in like what are the key analytics that drives, let's say if you are a GM of an NBA team, what are the things that you want to be looking at? And that was quite interesting, that game to game analytics doesn't make any difference. It's mostly noise. But what you are looking at is at an overall season. So you probably looking at a moving average performance across the season, or you are looking at your analytics from the previous season. So you're looking at it at a season level rather than at a game by game. And so that was number one. I think number two is that the driving factor a lot of the time is not more data. There are only a few vectors that drive predictability in performance. There are only few very important vectors that are important. Minute by minute coordinates on the court of each person, not a big predictor of anything at the end. But what you care about is like, what is your 3-point shooting percentage, or how many times you're getting blocked at the rim and things like that. So it's more high level than one would have imagined.
Yeah, I appreciated how disciplined he was in understanding that you can't look at data on a game by game basis, right? You have to look at it over a season if you're doing player evaluations, or even better, over 3 seasons or 4 seasons. So he has a really deep understanding of how to avoid noise and how to produce metrics that are actually meaningful.
Exactly.
And I have one more question for you before we sign off. So the Phoenix Suns, that's one of the NBA teams. They just sold for, I think, around like $4 or $5 billion. How many analysts do you think the Phoenix Suns have in their front office?
I probably think maybe 1 or 2 max.
Okay, I'm searching right now. Dang it. I was really thinking that you'd say like 20. Like you're talking about an organization that's worth billions of dollars. So number of analytics positions, the Phoenix Suns have 4.
Pretty close in the same order of magnitude.
Close, yeah. Pretty close. I'm disappointed that you were so close, because I was like, there's gotta be like, 30 of these guys, just some that are doing like BI dashboards, other that are doing really deep analytics like John. But it just shows you, there's not a lot of opportunities. And for someone like John, like so experienced and has such an in-depth knowledge, like it's so hard to break in.
Yeah, because I think my hypothesis there is that it's probably going to be across all the teams, the distribution of analytics position is going to be like a power law. So there is going to be a few teams with loads of money who are investing a lot in data science and data analytics. And then there is a long tail of teams that are fundamentally operating based on the eye test, and reading stuff like, okay, I need to get 3 players and things like that. And they're just operating based on, the eye test or feeling. So
Yeah.
they probably have a couple of folks there who just needs to print fancy PDF reports that they can circulate during board presentations and things like that. So that's why I was like, 2, 3, that's about it.
Yeah, what's interesting is that the cheaper market, so the smaller market teams actually invest more in analytics historically because they're trying to use that as a competitive edge. It's something that they can do, relatively cheaply to gain a
Right.
competitive edge. It's kind of like the Moneyball concept, right? Like the
Right.
Oakland Athletics, they don't have a lot of resources. They couldn't pay big bucks like the Yankees. So they're like, okay, we got to use data.
It's
to do
cheaper
that.
to
And-
buy. It's cheaper to hire a data engineer or a data analyst than to
Yeah.
buy a player.
Mhm. Yep.
That's
And,
pretty interesting.
Yeah. So, but he was saying, that there's just still aren't a lot of positions across the board in the NBA. Maybe other sports have more opportunity.
That could be a fun analysis, though. That
Mhm.
if you take Major League Baseball, Major League Basketball, and NFL, and if you have all the teams, just out of curiosity, how many data analysts each of these teams have
Yeah.
versus whether they are a top tier team or middle tier team or a low tier team,
Mhm.
And if you say what you're saying is true, it could be that the top tier teams don't care. It's like we've got the stars and the big bucks. We don't need analytics. We know we have
Mhm.
a LeBron or something like that. The bottom tier is like, hey, we are bottom tier. We don't care. We're going to be bottom tier. Is the middle of the pack where the most of the competition is. And they are like, hey, we are neither there, neither here. So we need to be really focused on our analytics.
Yeah. And I'm also wondering if NBA teams have less data professionals simply because they're not dealing with unstructured data that frequently. And they're not producing their own data necessarily. Like John was saying that they're buying this data and it's already, it's already in perfect format for analysis. So you don't need all those positions. It's kind of like the Bloomberg terminal or whatever, like all that data is already there. You just need an analyst in theory. So you don't need, that many. So it could be something like that, but I have no idea
I have
neither. Why there's less professionals.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, sweet. That was awesome.
Yeah, it was very conversational. It was pretty cool. Yeah. And he was so articulate. He knew his stuff in and out.
Well, we got to rest up because we got another one in about 3 hours. So I'll see you then.
Exactly. See you later. Ciao.
See ya.